Good afternoon. I'd like to call to order this Community Development Committee meeting of the Pierce County Council today on March 20th, 2023. The time is approximately 1:32 p.m. Madam Clerk, will you please call the roll?
Councilmember Morrell,
Here.
Councilmember Campbell,
Excused.
Councilmember Krueger. Here. Councilmember Denson.
Here.
Councilmember Mello.
Here.
You have 4 members present.
Thank you. 4 members present is a quorum. Item 3 is approval of the agenda. We have one proposal in front of us related to the comprehensive plan amendments and an update on the 2024 bigger comprehensive plan update. Is there any objection to approving the agenda as published? Not seeing any, the agenda will stand approved. Item 4 is approval of minutes of the March 6, 2023 meeting. Is there any objection to approving the minutes as submitted? Not seeing any, the amendments will stand approved. Item 5 is proposal number 2023-8. Madam Clerk, will you please read into the record?
Proposal number 2023-8, an ordinance of the Pierce County Council adopting the 2023 amendments to Title 19A of the Pierce County Code, Pierce County Comprehensive Plan, relating to comprehensive plan policies and land use designations, the Graham Community Plan, the Mid-County Community Plan, and the South Hill Community Plan, adopting findings of fact and setting an effective date.
Thank you. Mr. Krueger to brief the committee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and my comments will be very brief. Before we turn this over to department staff to describe the amendments that are before the committee specifically, as the title of this proposal indicated, this legislation would adopt amendments to the Pierce County Comprehensive Plan and several of the community land use plans. The 2023 Comprehensive Plan amendments include 6 amendments to the Comprehensive Plan and 3 amendments to community plan areas. The amendments would modify the land use designation through map amendments in several locations, and it would add policy and text amendments to the Graham, Mid-County, and South Hill community plan areas. If I could have the clerk go to page 8 of the electronic packet, which is one of the pages of the staff report, you will see a table that describes the amendments that are before the committee. There were a total of 14 amendments that were initiated for consideration by the council back in September. At this time, there were a total of 7 amendments that were considered by the Planning Commission. The reason for the reduction was that several amendments were withdrawn by the applicants or otherwise no longer pursued. There was 1 amendment proposal that was denied by the Planning Commission and is therefore not in your package. And the 6 amendments that will be discussed in detail with department staff are shown in this table. I would be happy to take any questions at this time. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Krueger, can you remind us which proposal council sent to the Planning Commission that got removed by the Planning Commission?
Specific amendments that were removed?
Please, if you have it handy.
I do. And so just to clarify what you're asking for, several amendments were withdrawn by applicants, never were reviewed by Planning Commission.
Okay.
And then another amendment was denied.
That's the one I'm interested
Okay.
in.
So back to, if the clerk could pull up page 8 of the electronic packet, which is page 3 of your staff report, you will see the first amendment on the list in the table, application number 993394, which was proposed by an applicant, 9421 Graham LLC. And this was a map amendment that would redesignate one parcel from moderate density single family to mixed use district. And this is in the Graham area. It's just off of Meridian, kind of on the west side of Meridian. There was quite a bit of discussion at the committee regarding this particular amendment. As I understand it, the underlying property owner, which is not the applicant in this case, is not interested in pursuing the amendment. And so that kind of, I think, went into some of the thinking regarding the Planning Commission's recommendation. The applicant wasn't able to withdraw the amendment, of course, because they hadn't made the amendment. I'm sorry, the property owner couldn't withdraw the amendment. And so it went through the process, and ultimately the Planning Commission denied that proposal. It's not included in the proposal before you this afternoon. The committee could reinsert the proposal. That's an option for the committee. It would take an amendment to do that. One of the committee members would have to ask for an amendment to reintroduce application 993394. put it back in the package.
Thank you. We're about to get a more detailed presentation by department staff, but before we do that, Councilmember Campbell has joined us for some time. Any other questions for Mr. Kruger before we turn to department staff for their presentation? Not seeing any. Ms. Silva, thank you for joining us. Let's turn it to you to give us a further briefing on this proposal, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon, committee members and members of the public. As Mr. Kruger mentioned, today's presentation is related to the 2023 Comprehensive Plan Amendment Cycle. Next slide, please. So as Mr. Kruger mentioned, our Pierce County Code identifies essentially every 2 years opening up for consideration of applications on a number of different amendments to the comprehensive plan as well as community plans. Those who can apply during those open application periods, which we had an application period between July 1st and August 1st of 2022. That could be interested parties, cities and towns, but also county departments. It was later in September, a council initiated 9 out of the 14 applications received, and also taken into consideration as part of a second agenda item on today's committee agenda is also we are recognizing we are going through a mandatory periodic update to the comprehensive plan, which is due later in 2024. Following initiation, the department then analyzes the proposals further, and we also reach out to land use advisory committees to receive a recommendation and before we finalize our staff reports related to each application. As part of the legislative process, as Mr. Kruger mentioned, we do go through before the Pierce County Planning Commission for a review as well as their recommendation, which they have rendered. And we are here today before the council committee to the final stages of that legislative process. Next slide, please. As outlined in Pierce County Code, there are 4 amendment types. Urban growth area amendments, which we do not have any in this amendment cycle. Area-wide amendments, which we have 4 applications that have been recommended by, that have been reviewed by the Planning Commission, as well as text amendments to the comprehensive plan, which are currently not associated with the proposal today, but also community plan amendments, which are reflected as 3 applications before you. Next slide, please. In terms of process, I mentioned, again, we had our application period in summer of last year. Fall, council initiated through resolution 9 applications of the 14. 2 of those 9 applications were withdrawn by the applicant, specifically Clover Creek Power. As we enter into the fall and winter months of 2022, we sent out notifications via letter to affected agencies, cities and towns, as well as service providers and tribes soliciting input on the proposed applications. If there was an area-wide amendment, we would not only do site postings of the proposal itself, but also notify property owners within the surrounding area. And last but not least, updating our website with available information as we continue throughout the process. Before we entered 2023 in December, we met with all applicable land use advisory committees, whether that was in South Hill, Graham, or Mid-County, which each of them have rendered a recommendation on each of the applications. And then once we completed that, we entered a study session as well as a public hearing before Planning Commission at the beginning of this year. Next slide, please. So specifically, we have proposals in several different community plan areas. Mid-County, Graham is South Hill. As reflected on the screen, you will see not only community plan amendments in the particular community plan area, but also area-wide amendments within those plan boundaries. Some of these you will see are companion applications. One may amend the community plan policy, for example, but also a area-wide amendment accompanying it to change the land use designation and zoning classification of a particular property or properties. Next slide, please. So as we're going to go in a little bit more detail of the 7 applications reviewed by Planning Commission, as Mr. Kruger mentioned in your ordinance package, only 6 are recommended by the Planning Commission as well as department as well. So first batch, we're going to review South Hill Community Plan. Next slide, please. So this proposal is submitted by Tacoma Water. It's a community plan amendment. The intent of the proposal would add policies to allow public institution land designation to be applied in the South Hill Community Plan area. There is a companion amendment, which we'll go through separately, that proposes to apply this public institution designation to property owned by Tacoma Water. Ultimately, Tacoma Water would like to already provides domestic water supply on the property, but would like to have a permitting avenue to move forward to install a microwave tower. Next slide, please. So in terms of recommendations, the department recommends the application as it would it reflects state, regional, and local policies, as well as ensure delivery of urban services for existing and future growth. The South Hill Advisory Commission also supported the proposal, and so did the Planning Commission, rendered a recommendation of approval. Next slide, please. As it relates to Tacoma Water's companion amendment, so again, changing certain properties totaling just shy of 100 acres, redesignating the property from moderate density single family to public institution. As mentioned before, the goal of the applications in total is to provide a process for Tacoma Water to initiate a land use application to permit a microwave tower to support service delivery. If this amendment was approved, again, follow-up code amendment implementation would be necessary and would follow a separate process for approval. Next slide, please. So here's just an aerial image of Tacoma Water site, but also the surrounding land uses related to that. Next slide, please. So in terms of the area-wide amendment for Tacoma Water, the department recommends approval. Similar to the community plan amendment, it ensures delivery of urban services for future as well as existing growth. And again, applying this designation in the community plan reflects the intention of state, regional, and local policies. The South Hill Advisory Commission supported the proposal, and the Planning Commission rendered a recommendation of approval as well. Next slide, please. And here's our last South Hill proposed application. This is an area-wide amendment proposed by the department itself. The intent is to correct a map error that occurred in 2022, just shy of 2.5 acres in size. The proposal is to redesignate the high-density single-family designation to high-density residential with a moderate high-density residential zoning classification. The intent of this map correction, and unfortunately in 2020, as part of the update to the South Hill Community Plan, these properties were unintentionally zoned as high-density residential. The properties are currently developed and reflect the proposed, which is, again, high-density residential designation with an implementing zoning of moderate high-density residential. Next slide, please. So here's just an aerial image, again, as well as the land use of the proposed land use of the proposal and surrounding area. Next slide, please. So the department recommends the proposal. Again, the intent is to correct a map error that occurred in 2020. The property already reflects development patterns of the moderate high density residential zoning classification. It is consistent with local, regional, and state policies. And originally in 2020, the Planning Commission did amend the proposal to retain the designation and zoning we're seeking here today at the property owner's request. However, when the map was created, it was drawn in correctly, and the properties were zoned incorrectly and approved through the legislative process that way. In addition to the department's recommendation, the South Hill Advisory Commission also recommended the proposal, as well as the Planning Commission. Next slide, please. As we're rounding completed South Hill, we'll be moving into the community plan area request. Next slide. So this proposal is a community plan amendment from Momentum Civil LLC. They're proposing policy revisions to allow larger buildings for agricultural supply sales, such as feed stores in the rural neighborhood center, as well as Rural 10 land use designation. As part of some background information, the community plan policy limits agricultural supply sales to a very small scale that serve resource and rural needs. If approved, it would allow policy support to amend the code in a future process that would allow up to 30,000 square feet in the R10 zone specifically. And as mentioned before, if approved, follow-up code amendment that would also seek public comments as well as a SEPA environmental review would also be needed to implement the policy revision. Next slide, please. The department recommends a modified proposal based upon the application, again, suggesting a minor revision to proposed policy language. In our current county code, agricultural supply sales are considered a resource use. In today's code, that already allows in the RNC zone stores up to 30,000 square feet. In comparison, the RAC zones, Rural Activity Center zones, also allow stores up to 80,000 square feet. As part of our coordination with Economic Development Department, neither zones contain enough available lands to build agricultural supplies. And as the applicants demonstrated in their application, market demand for these uses and contributes to a rural and resource economy lifestyle and character. The Graham Advisory Committee did not support the proposal, and it was as it was not needed. And also the Planning Commission recommended the department's modified policy revision. Next slide, please. Our second grant proposal is an area-wide amendment. Again, this is just shy of 2 acres. The proposal is to redesignate moderate single family into mixed use and be implemented through a moderate high-density residential zoning. The goal of the application is to provide additional affordable housing opportunities for existing residents and future employees within the Frederickson Industrial Center. Next slide, please. And here's just an aerial. Again, it's a single parcel, just 1.5 acres in size. And you also see the current zoning as well as the proposed zoning on the site in the application. Next slide, please. The department does not recommend this proposal, as the proposal is not consistent with Vision 2050 regional growth strategy, but also Pierce County's adopted growth targets, as this adds housing capacity in the geography known as urban unincorporated regional area, which will go later as part of our EIS alternatives agenda topic. In addition to, as part of those adopted growth targets, especially for the urban unincorporated area, growth targets were tied to future housing and employment needs with existing vested and pipeline projects only, as well as part of our public engagement and notification of the site and surrounding property. The property owner is not the applicant of the proposal, and they do not support the proposal. As we met with the Graham Advisory Commission, they also did not recommend the proposal, nor did the Planning Commission. Next slide, please. And here's our last batch related to the Mid-County Community Plan area. Next slide. So this one of 2 of Cross Creek Partners' proposed applications in this community plan application. The proposal is to delete all policy framework related to high-density residential district in the Mid-County Community Plan. Again, this proposal is a companion amendment to an area-wide amendment I'll go into shortly. If the proposed area-wide amendment is approved, the Mid-County Community Plan would not have any remaining properties designated as high-density residential. Next slide, please. The department did not recommend this application. The application of high-density residential district within the community plan may be appropriate at a future date. So retaining that policy framework in the plan itself would provide a nice foundation to build upon in future considerations. As part of the Mid-County Advisory Commission's review of it, they did support the applicant's proposal to delete the policy language. In addition to, the Planning Commission recommended the proposal as well. Next slide, please. And the companion elements, again, I mentioned deletion of that high-density residential designation. This would redesignate the property to something else. So just shy of 40 acres in size. The area-wide amendment would redesignate the high-density residential to corridor that would be implemented with the employment corridor zoning. Some background context, this was a 2015 comprehensive plan amendment that was approved to change from employment center to community center. As part of the 2020 Centers and Corridors planning, it changed the surrounding uses to employment corridors, or ECOR. The only remaining parcels designated as high-density residential are the 38.5 acres in this application. Next slide, please. So here's just an aerial of the several parcels as part of that application, as well as current and proposed zoning and the surrounding zoning of the area. Next slide, please. The department recommends a modified proposal, redesignating the property from high-density residential employment to employment center. The employment center is the land use designation that implements the ECOR zoning classification. The modified proposal provides consistency with the surrounding urban land uses. As part of the Meg County Advisory Commission's review, they recommended the proposal itself as well as the Planning Commission. Next slide, please. I'm happy to answer any questions the committee may have at this time.
Thank you, Ms. Silva. Let's take committee questions, and then we're going to open this up for a public hearing, and then bring it back to the committee for further deliberation. So what committee questions do members have before the public hearing? Not seeing any at this time. I'm certain, well, I was going to say I'm certain there will be many after the public hearing, but Councilmember Krueger.
Thank you, Chair. I just was curious, maybe a misunderstanding. On the Tacoma Water, was there a parcel they were wanting to remove residential, and it's for supplying a tower and making it, what was that term? Public institution?
The proposal is all properties owned by Tacoma Water specifically. It is currently zoned residential. One of the applications, again, is to redesignate it to public institution. The goal of the application itself is, again, to ultimately get to a code amendment process that would allow them to submit a land use application to improve the site with a microwave tower. The policy change, as well as the area-wide amendment, is one of many steps to implement that particular proposal itself. So they would like to further align overall the intent and use of the property with public institution, but also a future code amendment to allow a permitting process for them to submit an application on the microwave tower would be needed if the applications were approved by council.
Okay, so if we're not losing the housing, they're just adding public institution to do a microwave tower?
Yes, ma'am. That they have no intention of doing housing on the property.
How many units of housing would there be had there not been this?
I would have to follow up with the committee on that. I don't have those land capacity numbers off the top of my head, but let me dig a little bit further, council member.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councilmember Morell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Silva, just one of the questions that I had pertaining to, I think it was one of the maybe mid-county requests, where you mentioned that the property owner was not in favor of the rezone. How does that happen?
Great question, council member. I believe it was in the Graham Community Plan application. It's a 9421 Graham LLC. As part of our procedures identified in code, unlike land use applications, when it comes to application submittal and content, a landowner attestation is not required as part of that land application submittal. What we found through this process, and along with our notification to the property site posting, but also surrounding property owners, is an area for process improvement, as well as clarification that the landowner of a proposed application should be aware of an application being submitted, but also okay with the application being submitted on their reflected property. That came up several times through this process.
Yeah, okay. And I did notice it was a couple times it popped up, so thank you for explaining that.
Thank you. Councilmember Denson.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Silva. This is a lot of information a lot of moving pieces. I had a couple questions. One was on the Momentum Civil LLC amendment 994698. The LUAC, the local LUAC, denied this or did not recommend this. Could you go into a little bit more detail on that? I'm really sensitive when the local residents are not in favor of, especially a large facility, a large business coming into their community that they're not supportive of. Can you just elaborate a little bit on their thoughts and why the department felt like it was appropriate?
Fair question, and thank you for asking it. Part of the LUAC review also allowed opportunities for residents to provide testimony related to that. So we did receive some testimony from residents in the Graham Community Plan area about the proposal itself, which disagreed with the need that there is availability of land for within the activity centers or the LAMRID boundaries in particular, and also clarification whether or not an R10 zone would be appropriate for the agricultural use. As part of that testimony and review of the application, the Graham Advisory Committee agreed that it was not needed, that there was availability in our LAMRIDs within the Graham community area that could provide that. Is in terms of the Planning Commission review, they received the same testimony that the LUAC received, but also received additional testimony related to that. So again, there were some back and forth discussions on whether or not it was needed, whether other community plan areas that allowed in the R10 zone, for example, agricultural supply and sales. There is one community plan area, Key Peninsula in particular, that does allow agricultural supply in stores in the R10 zone up to 30,000 square feet. So there was discussion in terms of consistency amongst other community plan areas on the topic. In terms of the department's review, again, we worked very closely with our economic development department, and we summarized those findings on the demand for these type of agricultural and resource supply services and how that supports rural economy, but also available information on market about the square footage need for these types of facilities, but also the need for allowing more opportunities to support that agricultural activity in the rural area. So specifically, a lot of stuff is summarized in the staff reports as well as the comments, and I think Planning Commission as well as the department just had a different perspective in looking at this in the long term, as well as where are a lot of similarities in other community plan areas such as Key Pen.
So ultimately, the Planning Commission decided that there was not adequate land for a facility like this that was zoned appropriately. So we needed to rezone this property or this area? No?
The proposal itself is not redesignating any properties. It's simply changing a policy in the Graham Community Plan area, as mentioned before, to allow agricultural sales up to 30,000 square feet in the R10 zone, for example, would need an implementing regulation update. So we'd have to go through the code amendment process, which would, again, allow opportunity for further comments, Planning Commission review, environmental review under the State Environmental Policy Act, and would be subject to this committee as well as full council as part of the final decision.
Mr. Kruger has something to add, if that's okay with you, Councilmember Denson.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to add that, as is typical, the department has done a lot of analysis regarding the applicant's intent, deep dive into the regulations, looking at other community plan areas for consistency, as well as what's happening out in the Graham area. So there's a lot of work that's been done on this particular amendment. But if you take a look at what's actually before the committee in terms of the proposal, it's very, very limited. And I wanted the committee to be aware of that. So if you take a look at Exhibit B, which shows up on page 12 in your packet, all the amendment that's before you would indicate that in the rural activity centers, the rural neighborhood centers, and the rural 10 zone in Graham, structures should be at a scale not exceeding the size of the rural character. So it's a little bit innocuous, but that's what it's saying. And then there's a policy that would be struck, and the policy that would be struck says structures in the rural neighborhood center and the rural 10 zone should be very small scale. So again, just want to make it clear to the committee, there's not a lot happening in this amendment specifically related to any future business activity. It's a policy modification to clear the way for a future zoning code amendment, which could be, as Ms. Silva points out, up to 30,000 square feet for agricultural retail sales, but that's not before the committee today.
That would have to come back before.
That would
the
have to come
committee.
back, there'd be an analysis regarding that particular use in the Graham area as to whether or not that's a good idea.
But it would then be presumably consistent with the policies as amended.
If the council made a decision that that size of structure in the rural 10 was consistent with rural character, then yes, that would be the question at that time. Right now, arguably, a building that large is not a very small scale, whatever very small scale means. That's what's proposed to be eliminated, is the language that obligates structures in the rural 10 zone and rural neighborhood center to be a very small scale. That's what this amendment before you right now would do, would be to eliminate that language.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I had an ability to look at Councilmember Kruger's question on land supply for the Tacoma water parcel, if that's okay to respond, sir.
Let's come back to it in a minute. Thank you, Ms. Silva, for being so responsive. I think Councilmember Denson still has a couple more questions.
Well, I have one other question on a different project, and that is the Cross Creek Partners Project, 993797. I just wanted to know if you could comment a little bit. We would be changing this from high residential density to employment corridor. So is that in line with our goals of more housing in areas such as this? And do we have any detail on what kind of employment facilities would be allowed? Like, are we talking warehouses, or, is there any kind of definition about what that would look like?
Great question, Councilmember Denson. Again, this proposal for the area-wide amendments, about just shy of 40 acres. Proposal is, again, to implement through the E-Core zoning. The application itself cited a variety of different reasons why they are seeking a different designation and zoning. They cited previous centers and corridors planning updates that focus a majority of growth along major transportation corridors. In the current designation and zoning is out of whack of that, but also they looked at surrounding properties of a variety of different industrial uses as well as office uses, and the proposal would be more consistent than having residential in the middle of it. In terms of the type of allowed uses in that area, bear with me, I'm trying to open the zoning allowed uses, but it really is light industrial activities, warehousing, as well as commercial and office uses in that particular zoning as part of the proposal.
So would warehouses be allowed then, or no?
Let me verify if there was limitations on the square footage there. Councilmember, I can follow up on that specific question.
Thank you. You're amazing. Let me just say, information is amazing. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go back. Ms. Silva, I think you're prepared to come back to a question Councilmember Kruger asked earlier.
Absolutely. So Councilmember Kruger, you asked about the Tacoma Water, the redesignation of the property to public institution. What's the available housing capacity? As it's been historically been used for utility purposes, it's never had, even though it's residential today, it's never had identified as capacity to accommodate future growth. So in short, zero. It was never intended for development of housing. It just happens to have the wrong color and zoning classification to reflect its current use.
Okay. If I may ask a different question.
Go ahead, Councilmember Kruger.
Going back to the Graham, because it's such a small area, what lots or areas could it be put in? Where are the locations it could locate if it were to be allowed?
Are we referring to Momentum LLC's policy revision?
Is that the ag building?
Yes, correct.
Yes.
So the proposal, again, as Mr. Kruger mentioned, is to amend certain policies that apply to the RNC and R10 zoning specifically. So it's just allowing a future opportunity for a development regulation proposal. As I understand the applicant's intent, it's intended to apply to the R10 zone in the Graham Community Plan area. Because we're not pursuing or processing a development code regulation before the committee, we have not done the deep analysis of how many parcels that will apply to or specific parcels of availability at this time. We're just looking at the policy revision and whether that's consistent with the parameters identified in the code and questions we must ask, but also consistency with Vision 2050, Pierce County planning, countywide planning policies, as well as the Growth Management Act and the comprehensive plan.
So am I able to get a map of the parcels that would be allowed if it were to pass?
The policy is just changing the policy. It doesn't allow, in the R10 zone, for example, agricultural supply sales up to 30,000 square feet. However, in the R10 zone as a level 1, we know that the agricultural supply sales are allowed as I believe it's permitted use, but I will verify that. So I can show you a map of where it's allowed today, but today we are processing a community plan policy that would set the framework for a future code amendment.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councilmember Denson and Councilmember Krueger asked most of my questions right now, and I know we're going to have further discussion about some of these after the public hearing, so I'll further reserve my questions and concerns at that time. Let's open this up for a public hearing. Let's begin with those in chambers. Anyone in chambers wishing to provide testimony on proposal number 2023-8, please come to the podium. State your name for the record. Please state your name for the record. Keep your remarks to 3 minutes and focused on this proposal. There's a clock to your right in case you forgot how this happens in here after all this time.
I've been here recently enough to know how to read the sign. Thank you. Appreciate that very much. I have to often tell the people in the audience what to watch. My name is Bud Rayberg. Thank you for this opportunity to address the committee. Right up front, if I may, LUAC stands for Land Use Advisory Commission for staff's advice. Very frustrating when people try to downplay it with a twist of words or whatever, and perhaps unintentionally. So I'd appreciate it if staff would call commissions. Thank you. On to the two amendments in the Graham Community Plan area. I sat on the Graham Community Planning Board. I sat on the Graham LUAC for 10 years. I was actually here for the initiation of the Graham LUAC and testified on the ordinance that permitted it, 9774, something like that, I think it was. In any event, the Momentum LLC, there was a reason why the Community Planning Board recommended limited areas of commercial development in the rural area. At that time, the landmark criteria were relatively new. The concern now is that to allow this to start, and this is starting that direction, I appreciate staff's comment about we're not going there all the way yet, but this is the first step towards it. There will be a splurge of roadside stores in the R10 zone that we on the Community Planning Board certainly did not envision. And that's why this type of change to the policy was not entertained at the time. There was a lot of pressure at the time. This was shortly after GMA was being imposed on the county. And people wanted to be able to use the land however they wanted to, not understanding that you had to worry about your neighbors as well. But in any event, I would encourage you not to pass Momentum LLC. The LUAC recommended against it for a reason, or multiple reasons. Someday I could drop by Economic Development, talk to them, and see what their position was. With regards to the other, the Graham LLC amendment, the owner of the property was at the LUAC and was very worried about having her being zoned out of her own property. She's on fixed income. She can't really afford any increase in taxes, which the new zoning would. And again, the overriding concern is the property owner did not apply for it, did not want it, and it was still moved forward so far. And the Planning Commission seemed to take it out of the package, but here it is again still. do have some concerns about the Planning Commission and how they do their business and whether they actually follow their rules of procedure from time to time. We can talk about that later. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else in chambers wishing to provide comment on this resolution? Not seeing any. Ms. Price, anyone online?
For any member of the public wishing to speak, you can press the raise hand icon on Zoom or press *9 on your telephone keypad. And please state your name if you'd like on the record. First, we have Jim.
Yes, good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. My name is James Helm. I reside in the Graham County Plan area. I do want to speak to this amendment. We're dealing, first off, with square footage. Just for your information, the largest agricultural supply store in the county is 93,000 square feet in size. That's about 2.14 acres. 30,000 square feet equals about 0.68 acres, or about 6.9. 10,000 square feet is a quarter of an acre, and 20,000 square feet, which according to Rob Allen from the Economic Development Department, is 0.46. So that's about a half an acre. So we're talking about some small size lands. I totally disagree with the planning staff's comment that the RAC zone also allows, let's see, the RNC, the RAC zone also allows stores of up to 80,000 square feet. Neither zone, that's both the RNC and the RAC, contain enough available land to build agricultural supply sales. I presented documentation to the Planning Commission, 3 pages of which had 6 land parcels in the Rural Activity Center, which are vacant. One was 4.02 acres, another 4.59, another 4.73. 9.69 acres, 8.28, and 13.28 acres. I served on the Graham County Planning Board. We heard definitely from the community over a 4-year period what they wanted. So we highlighted that the largest agricultural supply stores would be in the RAC, smaller ones in the RNC. To my knowledge, we'll have to see if there's something in the future. The current Graham Hay supply store in the Graham RAC has 7,000 square feet on 1.431 acres. He can expand that if he wants to. As far as I'm concerned, Millennium Civil, I don't know who they are. I can't find any record of them with any activity in the Graham Community Plan area. I've seen something in South Hill, but there must be someone else behind a black screen pushing this, because frankly, I do not like seeing non-project community plans action like this coming forward to the council. We don't know what's going on. It's also important to remember that such stores are not permitted in the rural 10 areas in the significantly larger non-community plan areas of Pierce County. They're allowed on 10,000 acres in the rural farm area. So that was a decision that was made when the Pierce County Community Plan was challenged before the State's Growth Management Hearings Board, and that's how it got in there. But at this point in time, I think you should reject this and not send it forward to the council for action. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for considering my comments.
Thank you, Mr. Helmo. Any other hands?
No other hands at this time.
Not seeing any other hands, we'll close the public hearing on this proposal, bring it back to the committee. I'll just state, in alignment with some of the questions that we've heard and some of the public testimony that we heard, I, for one, am uncomfortable with the Cross Creek project moving forward at this time and the Momentum Civil LLC project moving forward at this time for consistency with our comprehensive plan, what our LUACs are expecting and what we're hearing from our LUACs, and too many unanswered questions about the rural character and what communities can expect to be in their neighborhood. By no means am I a NIMBY, very pro-growth here, but I'm hearing too many concerns from the local LUAC, which I too take very seriously, concerned about removing multifamily housing to employment corridor, again, for the reasons that we've heard in the public hearing. I, for one, can support the other proposals moving forward. Councilmember Campbell.
Thank you, Chair, and I apologize for being a little bit late to the committee, or if we discussed this procedure. So would we do an amendment right now to amend those out and then potentially move it forward to the full council, or is the hope to do an amendment at final?
You didn't miss anything, Councilmember Campbell. We didn't talk about procedure. So your question's a good one. The committee can make any recommendation they want about which of these we wish, if we want to move forward the package that's in front of us, an amended package, which I am suggesting at this time, or we could consider it further. As always, any member can bring any amendment at final as well. I think it would be a little cleaner if we forwarded something that the committee was in alignment with.
I'll return it back here to the rest of council for discussion for making any motions.
Thank you. Councilmember Denson.
Yes, I concur with removing the Cross Creek properties and the Momentum Civil LLC property, and I think I would also add the Graham LLC properties, the first, well,
That's
two
all.
on my list. Is that also in there?
It's not. I think they were just showing, so Mr. Kruger, correct me, but the application number 993394, the Graham LLC project, is not in this package. It was denied by the Planning Commission, so it's not in front of us. They were just showing it
I
to
got
us.
confused because there was a presentation about it, so I wanted to make sure. Okay.
Right, if you go, Mr. Chair, if I may.
Please.
The staff with Planning and Public Works, as well as myself, included all of the Planning Commission's recommendations in your packets for your consideration, including the 9421 Graham LLC proposal, which was removed by the Planning Commission. It was just to disclose that they had considered it and rejected it.
All right, just wanted to make sure. Thank you.
Hey, Mike, can you move your mic closer to you? Thank you.
Thank you. PCTV was just having a little difficult time picking that up. Is there any other discussion at this time? Seeing none, Vice Chair Denson for a motion.
So am I moving an amendment then?
Mr. Kruger, if a member wished to advance this proposal by removing the Cross Creek proposals and the Momentum LLC proposal, what would the appropriate motion be?
Staff would suggest you take those up separately. So not combine the two items because they are separate proposals that were viewed independently, and there may be different opinions on the committee regarding which ones should be removed. But one way to move forward would be an oral amendment. And so looking at the Cross Creek Partners proposal, an appropriate motion might be something to the effect of remove application 993797 and 993798 from the proposal in its entirety, including removal of Exhibit C, amending the title of the ordinance to remove the reference to the Mid-County Community Plan, and update the findings of fact accordingly. And then staff could take that oral amendment and make those changes. So that would be one way to tackle the Cross Creek amendment.
And then we could tackle we could debate the Momentum Civil one separately.
And pursue a similar oral amendment if that was the committee's interest.
Could Vice Chair Denson say so moved to what you just said in the record?
Or do I need to say it?
You can say so moved if the committee's understanding what we're talking about. That's the key here, is that the committee has a good understanding of what it is that your oral amendment is.
I understand it, and I so move it.
Second.
It's been properly moved and seconded to remove application numbers 993797 and 993798, the Cross Creek Partners projects, from this package, and the appropriate supporting material and exhibits. Thank you. Importantly, updating the findings of fact.
And amending the title.
Good,
I said
good,
so moved. We already did that.
good memories. Just trying to restate the motion so everyone knows what we're voting on, but I didn't do a very comprehensive job.
Great.
Discussion on the oral amendment in front of us. I think the community needs to have more conversation about what kind of employment center they want, if any, here. We hear a lot of concern about warehousing showing up amongst residential neighborhoods, taking up valuable land on our commercial corridors that may or may not be contributing to the kind of economic development that we envision as a council and as a community. And so in these kinds of corridors that have lots of people living around them, I think that's what we're trying to ask ourselves. What is best for the long-term economic development, health, and quality of life? Or should it stay residential? And in this case, pretty high-density residential. I'm hearing the committee say that's, with the LUAC's input, that's not quite settled yet. That's my thinking as to why I'm going to support this motion at this time. Councilmember Morell?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just looking at the visual on page 7 of 7, could someone tell me what the large structure is across the way? Does anyone know what that is?
Ms. Silva, we're looking at the aerial map for the Cross Creek project. Do you know what the land use is across the proposed site?
Well, thank you. I'm just getting to that particular page in the packet itself. But again, the adjacent land use is designated employment corridor. With that, and Councilmember Morell, what side of the proposal, northeast, or are you looking at in the aerial, sir?
I guess it'd be the east. It looks like you have a subdivision, then right in the middle, just east of the proposed rezone looks like a school commercial project. What is that?
Let me see here. It does look residential, at least from the aerial imagery, but to the further east, there is some commercial warehousing, building structure. I would have to follow up with you, sir, on the specific current use of that parcel further south of that subdivision. That includes 115th Street.
Okay. I mean, just looking at this map, there's obviously commercial facilities close by.
Do we understand Ms. Silva to be looking up information? Or?
I am, sir, but it's not pulling up fast enough. If okay, I would like to follow up with council staff on that particular current use of that property, of those buildings Councilmember Morell pointed out.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chair, if I may.
Mr. Kruger?
So I think I beat Angie in the race to the GIS map. The property that Councilmember Morell is asking about is referred to as Pan Adobe Cedar Homes, which is a lumber and wood manufacturing business. appropriately zoned, I might add, in the employment corridor, which is the property that's east of the railroad tracks in this location. I would also note, just for the record, due to the discussion regarding surrounding land uses, that this property is abutted to the south by the rural separator designation, so it is on the UGA boundary, if that helps in your conversation. Thank you.
And those are railroad tracks on here?
I believe so. I believe that's that diagonal lineal corridor is a rail line. It could be Tacoma Rail. I'm not certain about that.
Okay.
The motion in its most simplest form is to remove the Cross Creek Partners amendments in this package at this time. Seeing no other hands, all those in favor of the motion say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. The motion is adopted. Vice Chair Denson for a possible additional oral amendment.
Yes, I would like to make an oral amendment to remove application 994698 from proposal 2023-8 in its entirety, including any references in Exhibit C, amending the title and updating any findings of facts. How'd I do, Mike?
Very good.
Quick learner.
I wrote it down.
The motion's been properly moved and seconded. Remarks on the motion. Councilmember Denson?
Yes, I would say what struck me most was that the LUAC felt strongly that this was not an appropriate use of the land, and I appreciate that, and I'm very sensitive to that, having significant rural areas in my district as well. I can totally understand that, and so I don't feel it's appropriate given the LUAC's point of view, and certainly have concerns about unintended consequences and setting precedents and what could then grow out of allowing it at this time, or allowing this next step towards allowing such a large structure. Thank you.
Thank you. I will add, I'm going to be supporting the motion based on those comments and what we heard from in the public hearing. We can still do commercial structures in this zone. They just have to be appropriate in size and scale and in the rural character. And so for those reasons, I don't think this is appropriate either. Councilmember Krueger.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to say I appreciated the ability to bring this forward for discussion and for purposes of being analyzed, and it came out the way it came out. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for causing the good community conversation, Councilmember Krueger. I think it's a healthy conversation. See no further hands. The motion is as stated by Vice Chair Denson to remove application number 994698, known as the Momentum Civil LLC proposal. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. The motion is adopted. Councilmember Denson, to advance this as amended to the full council.
Okay. I move proposal 2023-8 as amended to the full council with a due pass recommendation. Oh, excuse me, Mr. Krueger.
Staff would just recommend that you roll all amendments into a substitute proposal and forward that proposal to the full council. It helps staff put together one final version for the council to consider.
I would like to roll all amendments into a substitute for proposal number 2023-8, and then move on to full council with a due pass recommendation.
Second.
It's been properly moved and seconded to roll all amendments into a substitute and advance proposal number 2023-8 to the full council with a due pass recommendation. Are there any final remarks? Not seeing any. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. The motion is adopted. Thank you, and thank you to the Planning Commission, the LUACs, department staff, and others for preparing that for our consideration. Currently, there's a date of final council hearing on that on April 11th. That brings us to item 6 of our agenda, the 2024 Comprehensive Plan Update. Mr. Kruger for an introduction.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I believe most of the committee members have been briefed by Planning and Public Works staff regarding their current scoping work on the environmental impact statement related to the 2024 Comprehensive Plan amendments. This afternoon, I believe Angie and Erica Rett-Hunt are on this call and will be providing a fairly in-depth overview of this work, where it's at, and they'll be looking for a conversation with committee members concerning the various alternatives that are being developed by the department as they move into this large scope of work for the 2024 Comprehensive Plan update. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Silva, welcome back.
Mr. Chair, I believe Erica Rett-Hunt will be doing the presentation, but I'll be responding to questions if needed.
Thank you. Ms. Rett-Hunt, thank you.
Thank you, Chair Mello. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm going to talk about our EIS alternatives that we're going to use to support decision-making during the Comprehensive Plan periodic review. Next slide, please. Okay. Sorry, I just have a computer issue here. Okay. The Comprehensive Plan guides county decisions about where housing and jobs should be located and how public investments are made in things like transportation, housing, jobs, utilities, parks, and other assets to support our current and future growth anticipated over the next 20 years. We use our environmental impact statement that accompanies this work to help inform the development of the Comprehensive Plan update. It's required under the State Environmental Policy Act for many major actions, and it focuses on identifying and avoiding adverse impacts for planning decisions and can help us to identify potentially beneficial outcomes. So it's a pretty powerful tool in our toolbox to give us information to make informed decisions. When we think about an EIS analysis, it's basically an if-then type of analysis. So in other words, if you decide to take a particular action, then how does it affect our environment and other systems, including our built environment and also our planning and policy systems as well? When in the if-then system, the ifs of our EIS analysis are basically called alternatives. And in our alternatives, we always study one alternative that says what would happen if we don't take any actions, and we kind of continue on the same path that we are today. And we call that the no action alternative. But we also study what happens if we do take action. And we often study more than one alternative about what happens if we take actions. And these are called the action alternatives. When we look at the alternatives, we get to the then part of our analysis. So if we take any of these alternatives, whether it's alternative 1 or 2 or 3, then the then part of the analysis helps us to understand how the alternatives have different impacts and outcomes in a variety of areas. You can see in the list here, we have a variety of areas that we've decided to study, including earth, ground and surface water, fish and wildlife, air quality and greenhouse gases, land use and housing, transportation systems, public facilities, utilities and services, and population and employment. So for each of the things that we study in the alternatives, we're going to identify how does it affect those areas. In addition, the county is going to be doing some supplemental work in 4 areas that are going to be integrated into these general areas of study, and that includes some work on the appropriate health and equity indicators to use to evaluate our planning process, as well as a cultural resources review, a climate change and vulnerability assessment, and a housing displacement review. These We anticipate these as being reviews that will then help us to provide additional information in our EIS analysis. The point of developing our alternatives is to provide information for decision making. So we use the alternatives and the impacts analysis to better understand the pros and cons of different kinds of choices. And this means that our community and our decision makers have the ability to weigh and balance ranges of policy options. Next slide, please. To come up with the alternatives in the areas of study in the EIS scope, there were several sources of information that we used. In June 2022, I came and talked with the CDC about the staff audit of the comprehensive plan and the proposed scope of work. In your packet, you'll see a finalized scope of work and supporting materials, including a draft or a preliminary draft of a checklist that we would send to Puget Sound Regional Council and Department of Commerce at the end of our proposal, or at the end of our work. We continue to update that checklist as the work commences. So we also held a public engagement period in September 2022. That was very important input. I gave you an overview of that input in November of last year, and your packet also contains a final report of that input, which includes the comments that we received and comment responses. All of these materials have been published on our project website. The council also adopted legislation, which included a growth targets ordinance in August 2022, which set the county's growth targets for population, housing units, and employment for our planning period to 2044. And the council also adopted 2 resolutions, one on climate change in June of 22 and one on transportation in October of 22. And some of the direction that was presented in those resolutions, you'll see has been integrated into our scope and alternatives. So lots of different information from lots of sources were included in the development of these alternatives. Next slide, please. Our goal for 2023 is to get our draft comprehensive plan, our draft EIS, our capital facilities plan, and our critical area regulations written so we can do a public review. So that's a tall order of work, and we've already started on some of this work, but we definitely need the EIS alternatives to continue to make progress. So if we look at this chart here, we see having our draft documents completed around the end of the year. And then there's quite a lot of process that happens in 2024, everything that's to the right of that, including planning commission hearings, issuance of a final EIS, and Pierce County Council hearings as well. All of that has to be adopted by the end of 2024. This is quite a lot, and it takes a lot of time because the process is iterative. It's going to give us multiple opportunities for public review in basically all of the stages that you see in the boxes on the screen. And before a final EIS is created, we also need to develop a preferred alternative. It's important to realize that as we're talking about alternatives in this in this presentation, most of the preferred alternatives are going to mostly when we get to the preferred alternative, you'll have the ability to combine features of any of the alternatives, 1, 2, or 3, anything that was studied in the draft EIS. Any of those policy alternatives can be combined to create the preferred alternative. And so that's important to keep in mind because as we look at the alternatives here, we're looking at a range of, a big range of alternatives that gives us the best flexibility to make choices about that preferred alternative in the future. So in addition to this process, one of the alternatives is going to include the potential for proposed changes to the Pierce County urban growth area. And if there are proposed changes to the UGA, that would require a review by the Pierce County Regional council, which would have additional public hearings and opportunities to comment. So if you think about the process that we have in front of us, we still have a lot of work to do, but it takes time and effort to provide a high quality of information for decision making. Next slide, please. So we're going to start by exploring our EIS alternatives. The alternatives that I'm about to present are intended to study these different choices and intended to result in potentially different outcomes. When we do this, we create the range of alternatives that represent different ideas. And sometimes you'll see an EIS that's developed to test a single idea or proposal, maybe with a little bit of variation. In that case, the EIS is really planning for a specific end result in mind. However, the EIS that we're planning for is an EIS that is going to support us in the process of decision making. So we're putting forth alternatives that are designed to be bookends of what the range of possibilities are. And the information that results from this study, again, we can use to pick and choose the policies and directions that are right for Pierce County. And it also, in developing the alternatives, we provide lots of opportunity for comparison and contrast. It also gives lots of opportunity for the public to have rich material and information for their public input. So with all of that preamble in mind, let's take a look at the alternatives. Next slide. Keep in mind, we're planning for a horizon date of 2024. So I spoke about our no action alternative. That is alternative one. This doesn't mean that nothing happens and everything stays the same. What it means is that we're going to continue to grow and change by the amount of population, housing, and employment that's identified in our growth targets. But we aren't going to make any major changes in how we approve our big planning ideas related to land use, housing, transportation, capital facilities, or the environment. So using the same policies we have in place now, we would continue to grow. That's alternative one, or no action alternative. Alternative two, we're calling our centers and corridors implementation alternative. So centers and corridors was the county's response to its last periodic review and update. And in that update, we started integrating policies about multimodal transit, planning for health, and increasing densities. But our centers and corridors policies and zoning regulations have only been in effect for a little over a year. And so this alternative would really continue on the mission to bend the trend of growth more in alignment with Vision 2050, our regional planning policies, and more in alignment with recent changes to the Growth Management Act to support affordable housing. This alternative represents strategic moves that would support multimodal transportation, improve climate resiliency, and support housing for people of all income levels. And a big focus of alternative two is really trying to support housing and housing production. In alternative three, while alternative two is our bend the trend alternative, we're calling alternative three our end the trend alternative. This is because this alternative seeks to rapidly shift growth, transportation patterns, and capital facility policies to create a very high density multimodal core in our high capacity transit area. At the same time, we would be simultaneously reducing capacity in areas not served by transit. This really embodies the core idea behind Vision 2050. It also provides a much more aggressive approach toward curbing climate change and looks at what are the actions that we need to make to reach the 45% greenhouse gas reduction within our time period. So in our no action alternative, as I mentioned before, it's fairly straightforward. We're not making changes in any of these major areas. We would retain our current level of service for transportation, capital facilities. We retain our current critical areas, regulations, and buffers. And we would keep moving along with our policies as they've been defined, but not making many changes. Let's take a look at alternatives 2 and 3. So for critical areas and hazards in both alternatives 2 and 3, they embrace the change from alternative 1. They both include our critical area updates consistent with best available science. Angie Silva presented on this to the committee in January 2023, and we also just completed a 6-week engagement period with the community on our best available science report. This, in alternative 2 and 3, our critical area and hazards would include proposed down zones of about 1,680 acres in the urban area. These are areas where there's hazards and new development is not indicated, or it would only be allowed at a very low intensity. Most of these areas have low potential for development and are consistent more with a residential resource zoning, which is what the yellow areas on the map show. These are areas where we would intend to down zone to residential resource. On the next couple of slides, we're going to provide some more comparison of how alternative 2 and 3 differ. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, I should have said next slide before. Could you do the next slide again? Thank you. And again. Okay, for land use and housing and growth, alternatives 2 and 3 take really different approaches. So by way of background, in 2021, the Washington State Legislature adopted House Bill 1220, which made changes to how communities are required to plan for housing. They were changes directly to the Growth Management Act, and it basically says the county needs to be planning for housing for all income levels to increase the variety of housing types and to address issues of housing displacement and racial equity in housing. The council did adopt a housing needs assessment to show last year, and it showed that Pierce County needs to produce a lot more housing overall, as well as housing affordable to specific incomes, permanent supportive housing, and emergency housing options. So Vision 2050 directs the county to plan new growth in areas that are served by transit. And that makes a lot of sense to build communities that aren't reliant on single occupancy vehicles, because that helps us to minimize roadway congestion and be responsive to climate change. But since our high capacity transit area is relatively small and characterized by a lot of existing development, we have to try and shape our 2 alternatives in order to balance these different objectives. So alternative 2 approaches the balance by focusing on housing production and affordability. It utilizes the entire urban area to provide opportunities for diverse housing types and housing production. This would also allow for infill development in the high capacity transit corridor, consistent with our centers and corridors policies and regulations that are already in place. And it would create some capacity for transit in that way. Housing production would be supported by making regulatory improvements that allow for additional housing production, such as authorizing a SEPA infill exemption, allowing gross density calculations, and consolidating similar zones, which will result in a density increase in some areas, and also by removing the urban sensitive overlay, which has been superseded in the past 20 years by significant improvements in our stormwater regulations and the proposed critical area updates. So there would also be in alternative 2, greater support for housing diversity and smaller unit types affordable to households with lower incomes. And it would include support for increased industrial development in Frederickson to provide additional jobs closer to home for local residents. When we look at alternative 3, we're focusing our new growth into the high capacity transit area to create a transit-oriented hub. The incentives for growth, we would incentivize growth in the high-capacity transit area by applying the SEPA infill exemption in that area only, and we would increase density within a half mile of our transit corridors while simultaneously limiting auto-oriented uses in favor of pedestrian-oriented uses. At the same time, while we're boosting and incentivizing certain type of development within our high capacity transit area, we would be discouraging growth outside of that area in a couple of ways. One would be by removing housing from commercial zones outside of the high capacity transit area. In our rural area, we would be eliminating rural density bonuses, and we would be retracting the urban growth area in areas not characterized by urban growth. And when I talk about these are the things that we would do, what I really mean by this is these are the ideas that we would study as a possible alternative. Later in the presentation, I'm going to talk specifically about the recommended areas of study for UGA retractions, but right now I'm going to finish our discussion of the alternatives. For transportation and capital facilities, it's important to realize these alternatives are responsive to the land use approaches that I already outlined on the last slide. Both alternatives expand our current vehicular level of service standard from a single pass-fail standard to a graduated system that's similar to that's used by other communities in our area. A graduated system, which is often implemented with classifications such as A, B, C, etc. It provides the opportunity for the county to adopt different service standards for urban and rural areas. It also allows the county to periodically modify its level of service to tolerate different levels of congestion. And you see a difference between alternative 2 and alternative 3. Both alternatives would adopt a new graduated system of level of service, but there would be a higher tolerance for congestion in urban areas in alternative 3 than in alternative 2. And that's specifically to support the development of high capacity transit. But outside of our vehicular level of service standards, the county is going to explore 2 different ways of supporting multimodal transportation through level of service. In alternative 2, we adopt a level of service for transit. In both alternative 2 and 3, we are adopting a level of service for transit in coordination with Pierce Transit. But in alternative 2, we will require new development to begin constructing the pedestrian bicycle network through design standards and requirements in the Pierce County Code. You may have heard presentations about this from our Office of the County Engineer, where they're talking about a model built on level of stress. In alternative 2, as a development occurs, non-motorized transportation facilities are built along with development as development occurs. It's a piecemeal approach that results in development happening on a property by property basis. This is intended to enhance the centers and corridors and assist in moving toward a greater multimodal access in the urban area. Alternative 3, however, takes a different approach to creating a multimodal network and by creating a level of service standard for pedestrian and bicycle facilities. As a formal level of service standard, it would be subject to concurrency, which means that development could be stalled if pedestrian and bicycle facilities can't be constructed at the time of development. So in order to support this type of development, we need to support the development of the network. And so you'll see alternative 3 also has the county exploring how it would invest in building and supplementing that pedestrian and bicycle network to facilitate development in the high capacity transit corridor. There's a couple other policy changes to explore in alternative 2. One would be allowing the expansion of rural roads that connect urban areas. The other would be expanding our sewer system within our urban growth area to do a couple of things, but primarily to reduce the impacts of small on-site systems and provide environmental benefits. They would also, that alternative was also study what would happen if the county created a water utility that would similarly consolidate the management of small water systems to provide environmental and health benefits. It would also allow the county to use reclaimed water. Alternative 3 includes an exploration of a limited implementation of Canyon Road extension. This was where basically it would not fully fund the Canyon Road northerly extension except for the Milroy Bridge replacement. This alternative was requested by council in its October transportation resolution. So when it comes to the environment and climate, alternative 2 and 3 also vary in how aggressively the county pursues a climate response. Alternative 2 continues to implement Sustainability 2030 with expanded programs for carbon sequestration based upon mostly our existing programs, but they would be expanded to result in the preservation and actually the conservation of an additional 50,000 acres over the current number of lands that we have set aside through programs such as current use, open space, public benefit rating system, the transfer of development rights, and conservation futures. So these expanded programs are intended to make progress toward the county's greenhouse gas reduction goals. Alternative 3 puts additional county resources to work in addressing climate change. The new policies and programs would set a goal to triple the amount of lands for carbon sequestration compared to Alternative 2. It would also work to support a 7% increase in urban tree canopy coverage to increase the county's average urban coverage to 40% in the urban area. These are the measures that we have included in Alternative 3, and they're intended to meet the greenhouse gas reduction goal of 45% by 2044. Carbon sequestration and energy efficiency, though, aren't the only contributors to greenhouse gas reductions. Our land use and transportation also contributes to greenhouse gases and climate change. And our county's Sustainability 2030 plan acknowledges the impacts of land use and transportation choices on our environment. So it's important to recognize that in addition to these very high targets for carbon sequestration and conservation, the changes that we're proposing in Alternative 2 and 3 are also intended to provide more efficient land use and improve multimodal transportation options, and those things also become part of the climate package that are studied in our EIS. So in the slide on land use, I mentioned that we would be, next slide, please. In our slide on land use, I mentioned I would be returning to a deeper discussion of the areas of potential UGA retraction that are included in Alternative 3. So the retraction of the UGA would be a significant policy change for the county. We have this at the end of our presentation, we have an analysis paper dedicated to this in the council packet because this does merit special review and discussion. Staff put a lot of effort into studying the UGA, and please keep in mind that the areas that we're going to show today are proposed for removal, but they're still areas of study. There's going to be lots of opportunities for comment and decision points in the process before any changes can be made. Okay. There's opportunity for the community and our government partners to review and comment on the areas when the draft EIS is released. Such comments will be considered in that selection of a preferred alternative. And if any UGA changes are included in the preferred alternative, there's both a Pierce County process of hearings as well as the hearings with the Pierce County Regional Council, as I mentioned before. Next slide. At each periodic review, GMA asks communities consider the sizing of their UGA or their urban growth area. GMA, the Growth Management Act, says that areas characterized by urban growth and urban services should be in the urban area. Areas that are characterized by rural levels of service, floodplains, resource uses, and low intensity of development should be rural. GMA defines each of these characteristics, but there's still areas of interpretation. And we also look at how we create reasonable boundaries and service area boundaries, and we don't like to leave areas, for example, of unincorporated area that are surrounded by rural area or by urban areas. So Vision 2050 adds some specificity to the requirements in the Growth Management Act, and they encourage the efficient use of land by increasing densities. The multi-county planning policies require that growth be concentrated in areas served by high-capacity transit, and that the county should be looking at ways to slow growth in unincorporated urban areas that aren't served by transit. Our countywide planning policies add some additional criteria for distinguishing urban and rural areas. So when we take all of these three policy documents, they help us to try and define how big should our UGA be and what land should be included in our UGA. In addition, next slide, in August, the County Council adopted growth targets in Ordinance 2022-46S. The adopted targets were set in a countywide process to be consistent with Vision 2050 policies, which means that population and housing growth in urban unincorporated areas, and those are the areas that are outside of high capacity transit jurisdiction, and population housing in rural areas are set well below our established growth trend of the last decade or so. The housing growth targets of the urban unincorporated area are specifically limited to the number of projects that were vested as of 2020, which is an artificially low number. We've continued to vest projects past that number that will have the entitlement to build in the last 2 years, and will continue to vest projects over the next 20 years. Between 2011 and 2019, annual housing production in the UUA, the urban unincorporated areas, averaged about 594 units. So if we continue this trend over the planning horizon, it would result in more than 14,000 units by 2044, which would be a growth of about 40% over our target. So when we're talking about bending the trend or ending the trend, this is specifically what we're talking about, is how do we change our trend of growth so that it matches these housing growth targets more to the levels where they've been set. In addition, our buildable lands report demonstrates that we have a very large excess capacity within the urban unincorporated area outside of our high capacity transit areas. The excess capacity is almost double the number of housing units of our growth target. And that's also problematic, because if we have so much opportunity to grow and we have a trend that is supporting higher than our target for growth, we're not going to be very aligned with our regional growth strategy. So as we go into the periodic review, there's a need to shift this growth to be more consistent with Vision 2050, which is why we have our Alt2 bend the trend and Alt3 end the trend. In our growth targets ordinance, the department was also specifically directed to consider the composition and character of the UGA. And so the urban growth area analysis in your packet does this, and its findings are incorporated into Alternative 3 in the form of proposed areas to study for removal from the UGA. So as we think about our UGA analysis, how did we go about doing this study? Well, we developed a methodology for identifying, next slide, please. We developed a methodology for identifying potential areas for UGA change. It was based on inputs and definitions from GMA to distinguish urban from rural, as well as a consideration of the policy objectives from Vision 2050 and the countywide planning policies. So we started with a GIS analysis to identify areas near our urban growth boundaries that were not served by sewer or transit. From there, we moved on to an additional context review where we began to look at vested projects, areas that were characterized visually or planimetrically by urban development. We identified critical areas in open space, and we did a review of buildable lands data. And this helped us to actually draw some boundary areas on the map for further study and discussion. These study areas were then reviewed by various departments and planning and public works divisions, including the Office of the County Engineer, Parks, Surface Water Management, Sustainable Resources, Land Use, and Environmental Review, and Sewer. And then we also talked to staff at the cities and towns that might be affected by potential UGA changes to assess future plans for the study areas and to understand other context that they may have better knowledge of. Next slide, please. So based on this study, we identified approximately 2,500 acres that might be suitable for removal from the UGA. These include areas within some city and town potential annexation areas, as well as areas that are not associated with a potential annexation area. And over the next slides, I'm going to go briefly into the areas that were selected to be included in Alternative 3 of the EIS. I'm going to go through these very briefly, but additional information is available in the UGA analysis. Next slide, please. So I'm going to, before I get into the details of this slide, I'm going to give you a quick orientation here. On the map, you will see areas marked in dark gray, in pink, and in yellow. The areas that are marked in dark gray or actually light green, those are areas within county jurisdiction. The dark gray areas are urban growth areas. They're urban growth areas, so they're urban designated areas. The yellow areas are urban areas that we studied, but we thought that they should remain in the urban growth area. And the pink areas are areas that we studied, and we are recommending that they be included in our consideration for removal from the urban growth area. So on this map, I'm just going to talk briefly about some of the reasons that we the pink areas and why we felt that they should be removed from the urban growth area. If you take a look at GH01, which is, so we're in the general Gig Harbor Peninsula. GH01 is the very southernmost little pink parcel. It has a small commercial area, but outside of that area, the rest of the parcel is not developable. When we look at GH03, which is the north part of Peacock Hill there, it has no sewer, it has significant environmental constraints and potential for open space. That seemed more like a better choice for a rural designation. And then GH05 and 06 are up in the Purdy area. There's a lack of fire flow up there that is limiting new development. It's very unlikely to be annexed, and there's a potential for habitat restoration. There's also some critical habitat in that area. Next slide. In North Pierce County, we see up at the top right, AU01. That's an area that has very low intensity development and is not likely to annex into the city of Auburn. And then we have We have some areas here, PU01, PU02, outside of Puyallup. The first area outside of Puyallup is farmland that's in a flood hazard area. It's very challenging for the city to provide urban infrastructure there, and the city has identified that area in their plan as a rural buffer. The Puyallup Area 2 consists of flood hazards, wetlands, and potential conservation areas. Beyond the River Road frontage, the land beyond that is rural in nature. And then we also have, it's a very small area, SU01, just kind of southwest of Lake Tapps there. That area is adjacent to agriculture and characterized by large lot residential development. Next slide, please. In central Pierce County, none of these areas are in a potential annexation area, but we've selected some areas that we think are suitable for removal. PCO1 down in the southwest corner of the map is not sewerable and has low intensity development now. PCO2, which is just east of that, is difficult to sewer and is characterized by open space and wetlands. If we move up from the north from there, PC10 and also PC9 there are both areas where they have open space and habitat, but they're very low intensity development that's on the edge of the rural area. So they already meet many of the characteristics of rural development. PC08, which is right in the middle, is the 100-acre woods development, and it will never be used for urban development. The parks planning that might occur there can occur whether it's in the rural or urban environment. Next slide, please. On the plateau area, we have one area. It's the only potential annexation area of the town of South Prairie. It's characterized by wetlands and the potential for priority habitat. There's no sewer in this area, and South Prairie, the town of South Prairie, has limited capacity to extend its water service. So this area is recommended for removal. Next slide, please. Around the Eatonville area, we have a variety of areas. There's a lot of pink around here. Up in the study area 2, there's most of this land is in trust for open space, and there's no sewer development up there. In EAO3, there's open space around some salmon-bearing streams. This area is very difficult to serve and unlikely to be annexed by the town of Eatonville. And then down in the south of the town, there's also some land that's held in trust. There's a lot of open space potential here with salmon-bearing streams and significant flood hazards. This is also a very difficult area for the town to serve. So next steps. We were very busy our first year of the project assembling our interdepartmental team, developing and refining our scope, collecting input, hiring a consultant team, and identifying the alternatives for not just the EAS, but also the scope of work. So now the most intensive phase of our work begins. Our staff and consulting team are already hard at work developing draft documents, but we are at a point now where we need to start working on our EIS alternatives so that we can use them to set up modeling and assess the impacts of potential policy options. We need them to build our capital facilities plan and to better understand all of those options and trade-offs. So our goal is to be back to you before the end of the year with some draft documents. But of course, we'll have some progress reports planned throughout 2023, particularly on those parts of the work that inform the development of the whole project. Some of the things that we mentioned before, such as our climate vulnerability assessment or our critical areas review. And so those are our next steps. So this is the first update where I didn't start with our vision, but please keep in mind that we are working very hard with our vision of providing a really high quality and professional product for our public and for our decision makers. And so our vision and schedule are constantly driving our project and moving it forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Redhunt. There is certainly a lot here, and you have a remarkable knack for communicating very complicated information and lots of moving parts. So you continue to do an excellent job of communicating this to decision makers in the community. So thank you for your presentation. We'll have questions and comments by council. We'll start with Councilmember Campbell.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the great presentation. This question actually may be to Mr. Kruger. So this is a very big picture project that we're looking at here, looking at some areas. We get contacted by individuals who the zoning doesn't necessarily match what they want to do with their property. What is their process for bringing that forward, an amendment to the comprehensive plan to be considered? What is the timing on that?
Sure.
Please.
So if I may, there's a variety of ways where constituents can provide input into this process. The first opportunity, as a matter of fact, will be coming up.
I'm sorry.
Can you hear me better now? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So there will be various opportunities for the public to inform council of priorities. One of the first will be occurring at the committee on April 3rd, where you'll be considering a resolution where council members can bring forward individual amendments that you'd like the department to analyze as part of this work. I've spoken with several of you regarding constituent-driven issues. I'm planning to put those into amendments for the committee to consider as part of that resolution on April 3rd. So that's one avenue. Another avenue would be to work directly with the department. So constituents that contact your offices could be redirected to the department to make sure that whatever good ideas are coming forward would be on the radar screen of department staff through their public participation process. And those ideas could be incorporated as appropriate. There will also be a variety of public hearings once this work is compiled with the Land Use Advisory Commissions, with the Planning Commission, and then ultimately any proposal for amending the comprehensive plan does come back to this committee and council for your consideration. It is important, however, having said all that, that the department analyze the environmental impacts of whatever ideas might be coming to you from constituents that you think are worthy of consideration, particularly on big picture issues. So as an example, Erica went through today certain geographies that might be considered for de-designation from urban, put into the rural area. That's really a kind of a big picture item that concerns the capacity of the UGA and a lot of other considerations. Things that are big picture items like that really need to be on the department's radar earlier than later, because it's difficult to pull a proposal together at the end of the process when there hasn't been a complete evaluation of impacts. So having said all that, there are a variety of opportunities, like I mentioned, and I don't know, maybe Angie or Erica want to weigh in on this in terms of what their thoughts are, if I've missed anything. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kruger. I think you're spot on about how to engage through the periodic update of the process. Also, earlier today on the agenda, we talked about comprehensive plan amendments and the cycle that was opened in the application period in summer of 2022. I believe our next cycle per county code would also open up for applications for consideration, not just to amend the comprehensive plan policies, but also community plan policies, as well as area-wide amendments, for example. That opens up in summer, July of 2024, that will be processing well into for decision in spring of 2025. That is also another route for citizens interested in changing zoning outside of the periodic update timeline.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councilmember Denson, you don't have a question at this time?
Well, I think Mr. Kruger answered it. It was also about public participation, and because I've already gotten inquiries from local newspapers, for example, wondering, what's being done especially in the rural areas in terms of opportunities for the public to weigh in on the comprehensive plan. So should I just direct them to the website and to hearings, and I guess the LUAC in their area, or are we doing anything else in terms of outreach in especially our rural communities?
Thank you, Councilmember Denson. Part of the package, again, we understand it's a very lengthy package, but was a response to our first engagement period that had our scoping comment period associated with that. We had a number of rural engagement opportunities, as well as dispersed information available at that time. As we progress through different engagement efforts, as Erica mentioned in the presentation, we just got done with the critical areas engagement focus that ended on March 6th. We had a specific forum for rural property owners as well as the agricultural community to bring forth ideas on that particular topic. But as we move forward with draft public release, we will be detailing our approach and methods of that outreach well before we initiate it, and we'll be presenting that to this committee. But if there's questions related from newspapers, media outlets, feel free to have them direct to me, and happy to provide as much information we have at this time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Kruger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Silva, I'm wondering, on the parcels that you were looking to remove from the UGA, it seemed that they weren't really usable anyway, so why bother taking them out? Or taking them out of the UGA?
Fair question, and thank you for asking it. Part of our challenge, not only outlined in state law, but in various regional local policies, is to right-size the urban growth area to accommodate growth over a 20-year planning horizon. So that's two parts of that equation. That's land supply. If it's zoned this, how many people or jobs can we accommodate over the 20-year horizon, as well as the demand. What does our growth targets say? And one of the slides Erica discussed was different targets for different regional geographies related to our urban area. So part of that analysis, we look, are there some low-hanging fruits that are not characterized by urban growth or cannot be served by urban services? Those are very specific objectives in state law, but also regional local policies as well. So if it's not going to accommodate growth, then the question is, should it be designated rural in the first place?
And one more, Chair, if I may. Is there perhaps like a checklist to give a constituent that here are the things that cannot be challenged, such as if they don't understand what PSRC is and why are we planning under something that we don't know anything about, and they want to challenge that, yet that's a state law. Is there anything that has a checklist of examples that they cannot challenge in this plan, or things that they can?
I don't know as checklists specifically to that, but part of the actually the scope document that was part of the packet includes two checklists specifically. One developed by the State Department of Commerce about the not only state law, but agency rule making requirements as part of periodic reviews, and where it highlights local jurisdictions highlight areas that are subject for update based upon changes to rulemaking, but also state law. So that's part of the checklist, and as Erica mentioned, we are constantly updating that to make sure we have the most current information about our scope of work. The second checklist, as part of that packet of information, relates to the Puget Sound Regional Council, and they identify specific policies they will be checking with local governments as part of this periodic update to ensure consistency with Vision 2050, but also flags at a local level areas we need to focus potential policy changes to be consistent with that. As a member of PSRC, we are required at the tail end of the adoption of whatever preferred alternative is selected, we have to submit to PSRC to ensure consistency with overall Vision 2050. And that's how it's related to receipt of transportation funds that are distributed by that agency.
Thank you. It's just, it's such an overwhelming and, undertaking, and that folks who are not in, in this every day like you are, they wouldn't know where to start.
Understand that completely. Even for folks that are engaged with this stuff, often this is overwhelming. There's a lot of changes coming afoot, not just at the state level, but regional level, and how we plan for communities into the future. And we're trying to adapt and accommodate and work and test ideas that we may have not tested before.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councilmember Morrell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I don't, Erica or Angie can answer this, I'm quite sure. We've had, Angie, I think I've got a letter from you pertaining to changing some of the rural, the ARL land along a major corridor. Does that land that if it is removed out, that's ARL, does it have to be replaced somewhere else?
I'm not specifically. Usually lands that are designated agricultural commercial of significance have a number of site-specific criteria, like soil types, for example, are one of those determining criterias in how the county came up to designating certain properties of ARL. What has been as part of state law interpretation over its 30 years of existence is the conversion of those commercially significant agricultural lands and converting that to sprawl or urban development, because those are one of the significant kind of reasons why GMA was established in the 1990s in the first place, was those conversions of those properties. And oftentimes the hearings board has not favored that type of conversion from agricultural to some type of form of development, commercial, residential, or industrial. So there's some case law interpretation available for us to help guide the conversations further.
Okay. And the other question I had is converting R10 to ARL. Does that benefit us at all?
Erica, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, the county did a study of agricultural resource lands back in 2018. And at that time, the study was pretty thorough in looking at the state criteria for what is an agricultural resource land. And as Angie mentioned, it's always agricultural lands of long-term commercial significance. So there is some associated criteria with that, both from growth management and then also associated with case law. In the last legislative session in 2022, there was a small change that does require us, if we make any changes, either adding or subtracting agricultural resource lands, it would require the county to do a full study of agricultural resource lands, which we just completed a pretty good one in 5 years ago. And the characteristics that make up agricultural resource lands don't change that much in that time period. Changes to agricultural resource lands, we need to approach very carefully, and they need to be supported with that type of a study.
And that's specific to ARL lands, correct, Erica? And I believe the county does have a designation rural farm, which is not that higher level of ARL and the
Correct.
criteria used. So that, depending on the circumstances, that may be an option for further conversation.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Well, we thank you again for this. I don't have any further questions. We are studying a very broad set of criteria on purpose so that we could understand the impacts of many different decisions. And unless we study all of that, decision makers won't have the information necessary to make appropriate decisions going forward. So I'll just remind members of something mentioned earlier at the April 3rd Community Development Committee. We will be taking up recommendations for additions to the comprehensive plan amendment package. So please get with Mr. Kruger well before then if anyone is offering any amendments so that there's appropriate time to put those together. I'm not seeing anything else on this. I'll look to members of the committee to see if there's any other business today. Mr. Kruger, is any other business for the committee?
No, sir.
Our next meeting is April 3rd, correct?
I believe that's the Monday. Let me confirm that with the calendar, but I
I
believe,
believe so.
yes, April 3rd, 1:30.
Great, thank you. Seeing no other business, we stand adjourned.